Ladies and gentlemen, winning is not an accident. It is not a stroke of luck, nor is it some genetic lottery ticket reserved for a chosen few. Winning is a psychology. It is a mindset, a way of perceiving the world, of interpreting challenges, of constructing meaning from setbacks, and of engineering momentum where others see only walls. And when I say psychology, I'm not talking about shallow affirmations or motivational slogans that sound good on a poster, but collapse under the weight of life. I am talking about how the human brain, with all its electrical storms and biochemical pathways, conditions itself to either dominate or to surrender. You see, every human being is wired for survival, but very few are wired for victory. Survival is the default program. Avoid pain, minimize risk, conserve energy. That's biology. Winning, however, is a choice, a deliberate reprogramming of the brain to interpret fear differently, to engage with stress differently, to channel aggression and energy not into running away, but into running through. Neuroscience tells us that the brain is plastic. Neuroplasticity means it rewires itself according to what we demand of it. If you live in fear, if you constantly retreat, your neural circuits reinforce cowardice. If you lean into challenge, if you confront the uncomfortable, those same circuits adapt, strengthen, and rewire toward dominance. That's the science behind courage. I remember studying the brains of elite athletes, special forces soldiers, and high-performing entrepreneurs. Their neurological signatures looked different. Their amygdala, the fear center, did not stay silent. They felt fear like everyone else, but here's the secret. Their prefrontal cortex, the executive command center of the brain, overrode it faster, stronger, and with more clarity. They trained their brains not to erase fear, but to transform it into fuel. Fear becomes energy. Adversity becomes focus. That is the psychology of winning. Your brain learns to interpret the same stimuli that paralyze others as a call to action for you. But let's step back into the human story. You and I both know people who seem to sabotage themselves at every turn. They get close to a breakthrough, then collapse. They start with fire in their belly, then extinguish it with doubt. And if you trace it back, it's always the same culprit, the internal dialogue, the voice inside that whispers, "Who are you to succeed? Who are you to think you can do this?" And that voice isn't random. That voice is the echo of conditioning. Parents who doubted them, teachers who dismissed them, peers who mocked them, a society that taught them to aim low and play safe. That is not psychology. It is programming. And until you reprogram it, you will never win. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I worked with a young man who had talent spilling out of him. Brilliant mind, charismatic presence, ideas that could disrupt entire industries. But he was shackled by self-sabotage. He would start projects and abandon them halfway, not because they failed, but because he feared what would happen if they succeeded. And that's called the upper limit problem. Psychologists talk about it. People don't only fear failure, they fear the responsibility of success. It terrifies them. Because success means you can't hide anymore. Success means people expect from you. Success means you're exposed. And the psychology of losing embraces that fear and runs back to mediocrity. The psychology of winning, on the other hand, stares straight into that fear and says, good, let's go further. Now, biologically, what's happening here? Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation. Most people get their dopamine from cheap hits, scrolling social media, gaming, junk food, shallow validation. But winners train their brains to release dopamine, not when they get the reward, but when they embrace the process. They get hooked not on the applause, but on the grind. That's why elite performers will run mile after mile, hour after hour, long before anyone knows their name. They've rewired their brains so the act of pursuit, the act of discipline floods them with satisfaction. And once your brain is addicted to progress instead of comfort, you become unstoppable. But let's not get too abstract. Let me paint it for you with history. Think about Thomas Edison. The man failed over 1,000 times while trying to invent the light bulb. Do you think his brain didn't register those failures? Of course it did. Every failure is a stress signal. But Edison's psychology interpreted those failures not as rejection, but as feedback. He literally reframed reality. I didn't fail. I found 1,000 ways that don't work. That's not optimism, it's neurological resilience. His brain had been trained to metabolize failure into fuel. Or look at Michael Jordan, cut from his high school basketball team. Most people would have collapsed. but he wired his mind differently. Every insult, every slight, every dismissal became ammunition. He turned slights into steroids for his psyche. His psychology demanded, I will not just win, I will dominate. And the brain follows the mind's orders. Winning, my friends, is not a straight line. It is a psychological war. It is not just about beating others. It is about beating the version of yourself that wants to quit every damn day. And let me tell you this, that voice never fully goes away. Even champions wake up with doubt. Even billionaires question themselves. Even soldiers who've been through fire and blood hesitate before stepping back into the chaos. The difference is not that winners never feel hesitation. The difference is that they've trained themselves to act anyway. Now you might be asking, how do you build this psychology? How do you rewire the brain for victory when you've been conditioned for defeat? It begins with exposure, controlled exposure to discomfort. Every time you face discomfort and refuse to run, you are literally sculpting your brain. Synapses fire differently, new circuits are born. This is not theory, it's neuroscience. The more you face stress without retreating, the more your brain learns that you will not die in discomfort. In fact, you grow. Think about Navy SEAL training. They drown-proof candidates by binding their hands and feet and throwing them into a pool. Every instinct screams, you're gonna die. Panic floods the nervous system. But the ones who survive are the ones who learn to calm the storm inside their heads, to control their breathing, to master the psychology of survival until it transforms into the psychology of thriving. It's not about muscles, it's about mental reprogramming under fire. That's why so few make it through. The same principle applies to your life. You want to win? Then stop negotiating with your weakness. Stop feeding your brain cheap dopamine and start rewiring it with real challenge. When you feel like quitting, that is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that your brain is being tested, and if you push through, you've just built the neural architecture of a winner. One rep at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time. I'll tell you something else. Winners have a different relationship with time. Ordinary people live in the past, reliving mistakes, or in the future, fantasizing without action. Winners dominate the present. Neuroscience shows that flow states, the states of peak performance, emerge when the brain is so locked into the present moment that time distorts. Hours feel like minutes. Distractions vanish. That's the psychology of winning, mastering the present so intensely that nothing else exists but execution. And here's the hard truth. Most of you have been trained to lose. Society trains you to conform, to play safe, to never stand out, to never fail too big. Because when you're safe, you're predictable. And when you're predictable, you're controllable. The psychology of winning requires you to break that conditioning, to stand out, to fail publicly, to bleed in front of others, to risk humiliation, ridicule, and rejection. Only then does the brain learn that victory is worth more than approval. Now let me stop here because I want you to feel this deeply. Winning is not about trophies, money, or applause. Those are side effects. Winning is about building a brain and a spirit that refuses to bow. It's about becoming the kind of human being who can walk into chaos and carve order, who can walk into rejection and still move forward, who can face death, not just physical, but the death of dreams, relationships, businesses, and rise again. Because the psychology of winning is not just about achievement, it is about identity. It is about becoming someone who cannot be broken, no matter how many times life throws you into the fire. And the question you have to ask yourself is this: when that fire comes, when life tests you, when fear and doubt scream in your ears, will you run or will you rewire your brain and decide to win? The human mind is a battlefield where every thought either reinforces weakness or forges resilience. And make no mistake, your thoughts are not neutral. Every second, your brain is shaping reality. Think of the placebo effect. Patients given sugar pills, believing they've received powerful medication, sometimes heal at rates comparable to those taking real drugs. That's not fantasy, that's measurable, biological change driven purely by belief. Now imagine harnessing that same mechanism, not to cure an illness with a sugar pill, but to dominate life through a belief system so strong, it alters your performance, your biology, your destiny. That is the psychology of winning. But belief alone is not enough. The mind is not a magician. You can't just sit around chanting affirmations waiting for reality to bend. The psychology of winning demands action. Relentless, disciplined, uncompromising action. Because action reinforces belief. Every time you act, you carve grooves into the brain. That's how habits form. That's how identity cements itself. And when action and belief collide, you become unstoppable. Let me give you a more visceral example. Years ago, researchers studied London taxi drivers. Before GPS existed, these drivers had to memorize an impossibly complex map of London's 25,000 streets, a test they called the knowledge. What did neuroscientists find? These drivers developed enlarged hippocampi, the part of the brain responsible for spatial memory. Their brains literally grew to meet the demands placed on them. That is proof. You demand more from the brain evolves. You demand less, the brain atrophies. So ask yourself, what demands are you placing on your mind every day? Because whether you realize it or not, you are training yourself either into mediocrity or mastery. Winning psychology is not about raw intelligence, talent, or even resources. History is littered with gifted failures. People who had brilliance but no discipline, talent but no grit, ideas but no execution. They drowned in their own potential because their psychology was weak. Meanwhile, others with far less talent, fewer resources, and even greater obstacles carved empires out of nothing because their minds were wired for victory. Consider Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps. Stripped of family, possessions, dignity, and freedom, he discovered that the one thing no captor could steal was his ability to choose his response. In the most inhuman conditions imaginable, he reframed suffering into meaning. And meaning gave him strength. That, ladies and gentlemen, is winning at the deepest level. When everything external is torn away, the true psychology of winning reveals itself. Not in luxury, not in comfort, but in the raw ability to endure and rise. Now, if we shift from history into biology, you'll see this theme repeated again and again. Cortisol, the stress hormone, is often demonized. People think stress is the enemy. But stress, in small, controlled doses, is what builds strength, mentally and physically. It's called hormesis. You expose the body to controlled stress. Exercise, fasting, cold exposure. And the body adapts, grows stronger, more resilient. The same is true for the mind. Every challenge you face, every rejection you endure, every failure you confront, it's mental hormesis. But only if you choose to interpret it that way. Otherwise, stress crushes you. The psychology of winning is the ability to metabolize stress into strength. Think about this. The immune system works the same way. Shield it from all exposure, and it weakens. Expose it to manageable challenges, and it fortifies itself. The brain is no different. A life without discomfort is a life without growth. And yet, most people run from discomfort as if it were lethal. Winners run toward it. That's why they look superhuman to the rest of the world. But let's be brutally honest here. The psychology of winning demands sacrifice. You cannot wire your brain for victory while indulging in the same habits that keep you ordinary. You cannot crave approval and also demand greatness. You cannot worship comfort and also achieve dominance. Every winner you admire made a trade. They gave up something to gain something greater. The only question is, what are you willing to give up? I once spoke with an Olympic athlete who trained for 16 years before standing on the podium. 16 years! Every day while others slept, partied, or indulged, he was in the pool before sunrise. And when asked how he did it, he said, "I learned to love what others hate." That right there is the psychology of winning. It's not about talent. It's about conditioning yourself to find joy in the grind, to extract pleasure from pain, to turn suffering into an ally. But here's where the science gets fascinating. Neuroscientists call it effort paradox. The harder you work for something, the more your brain values it. Dopamine levels spike, not just at the reward, but during the effort, if you believe the effort matters. That's why cheap victories never satisfy, why shortcuts always leave you hollow, why unearned success feels empty. The brain knows. It craves struggle. It craves the battle. Without it, winning has no meaning. And yet, here's the tragedy. Most people will never experience real victory. They'll taste small wins, temporary highs, fleeting pleasures, but never the deep, soul-scorching triumph that redefines who you are. Why? Because they quit too soon. They choose the exit ramp of excuses They rationalize failure as fate. They retreat into safety instead of advancing into the unknown. And their brains adapt to that. Weakness becomes their default wiring. But imagine, just imagine, if you broke that pattern. If you trained yourself to stay in the fire one more day, one more round, one more battle. If you rewired your mind to interpret exhaustion not as defeat, but as proof of growth, that's when the extraordinary happens. That's when people look at you and say, what is different about them? Why do they keep winning when the rest of us fall apart? And the answer is simple. You forged a new psychology. I want you to think about the greatest breakthroughs in human history. Flight, electricity, medicine, technology. They didn't come from people playing safe. They came from people willing to risk ridicule, failure, and disaster. The Wright brothers were mocked. Edison was doubted. Every pioneer faced scorn. And yet they pressed on because their psychology was anchored not in approval, but in conviction. And conviction, ladies and gentlemen, is the seedbed of victory. Now let me challenge you directly. What lies are you telling yourself that keep you from winning? That you're too young, too old, too uneducated, too inexperienced? These are excuses wrapped in self-preservation, and every time you repeat them, your brain believes them. Neurons that fire together, wired together. You tell yourself you're not enough, and your brain builds that identity into a fortress. But the moment you flip the script, the moment you reframe, I may not be ready, but I will act anyway, you begin rewiring yourself into a winner. Do you understand how powerful that is? You are not a prisoner of your past, nor of your genetics, nor of your circumstances. You are a prisoner only of your psychology. And the key has been in your hand the entire time. So let me ask you, when you wake up tomorrow, what identity will you choose to reinforce? The psychology of losing, one more day of comfort, distraction, excuses, or the psychology of winning, one more day of discipline, courage, and relentless forward motion? Because here's the truth, the world does not need more survivors. It needs winners. People who refuse to bend, people who rewire their brains to dominate not only their circumstances, but themselves. And I will leave you with this, winning is not about beating others. It is about becoming the kind of person who cannot be beaten no matter what life throws at you. That is the psychology of winning, and if you choose it, if you live it, if you breathe it, nothing, and I mean nothing, can stop you.